The wedding invitation was addressed to my husband and me, and I found it in my sister's purse 3 weeks before the wedding was supposed to happen. Except the groom's name on that invitation wasn't the man I married. It was written in gold script, tucked between a lipstick and a crumpled receipt, and it read Michael and Rebecca. Heartily request the honor of your presence, and I stood in my sister's kitchen holding it for almost a full minute before I understood what I was looking at, because Michael Hartley was my husband, and I was the only Rebecca who had ever married him. If this is your first time here, welcome to the Quiet Rise. I tell true stories about the people who hurt us in the quietest, most unexpected ways, and if stories like this one speak to you, stick around, because we bring you a new one every single week. Now let me back up, because you need to understand my sister before you can understand what she was capable of. My name is Rebecca Voss, though for the first 31 years of my life, my last name was Ashford, same as my sister Claire. We grew up 14 months apart in a small house outside Columbus, Ohio, close enough in age that people used to ask our mother if we were twins, and far enough apart in temperament that anyone who spent more than an hour with us could tell exactly who was who. I was the quiet one, the one who did her homework early and kept her room clean and never gave our parents a reason to worry. Claire was the one who lit up a room, who could talk her way out of anything, who our mother used to say could sell sand to a man standing in the desert. I loved my sister. I want to say that clearly before I tell you the rest of this, because everything that happened afterward doesn't erase the fact that for most of my life, Claire was my best friend, my protector on the playground, the person who sat with me in the hospital hallway when our father had his heart surgery, the person I called first when I got into college, and the person I called first again when I got engaged. I met Michael Hartley when I was 28 years old, at a friend's barbecue, in the kind of meet cute that feels almost too simple to be real. He spilled a drink on my shoes, apologized like it was the worst thing he'd ever done, and drove 40 minutes the next day just to bring me a replacement pair because he felt so guilty about it. He was an engineer, steady, funny in a dry way that took people a minute to catch, the kind of man who remembered small details about your life and brought them up weeks later just to show you he'd been listening. We dated for 2 years before he proposed on a hiking trail in the Hocking Hills, down on one knee in the mud, because he said he couldn't wait one more day for the perfect moment. Claire was my maid of honor. She gave a speech at our wedding that made half the room cry, about how she used to be jealous of how easily I loved people, how I never held back, and how watching me find someone who deserved that kind of love was the greatest gift she'd ever witnessed. People still talk about that speech. I have it recorded. I used to watch it sometimes on hard days, just to remember that my sister loved me that much. I'm telling you all of this so you understand exactly how far the fall was, because 3 years into my marriage, standing in Claire's kitchen holding an invitation with my husband's name paired with a different Rebecca, I wasn't looking at a stranger's betrayal. I was looking at the woman who gave that speech. I didn't confront her right away. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. My first instinct wasn't anger. It was confusion, the kind so total it almost short-circuits your ability to feel anything else. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was a joke invitation for some prank. Maybe there was another Michael Hartley in Ohio, which, statistically, wasn't impossible. I put the invitation back exactly where I found it, and I drove home in a fog so thick I nearly missed my exit twice, and I sat in my car in our driveway for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside and look at my husband's face like everything was normal. That night, I watched Michael while he made dinner, chopping vegetables with the same careful, methodical motions he always used, humming along to whatever was playing on the radio, and I tried to see something different in him, some crack in the ordinary happiness of our life together. I didn't see anything. That almost scared me, more than if I had. The next morning, I did something I'm not proud of, but I think anyone in my position would have done the same thing. I went into his home office while he was at work, and I opened his laptop. He'd never hidden his password from me. We'd never had a reason to keep anything from each other, and that trust made what I was about to find feel even more like a betrayal, because it meant he hadn't even bothered protecting it. There was an email account I didn't recognize, a second email, separate from the one he used for everything else, and inside it were months of messages between him and someone named Becca, not Rebecca. Becca, I read maybe 30 of them before I had to close the laptop and sit on the floor of his office, because my hands were shaking. Too hard to keep scrolling. The messages weren't explicitly romantic. Not at first. That was almost the worst part. They read like two old friends catching up. Except the intimacy underneath the words was unmistakable to anyone who has ever loved someone and recognized what it looks like when they start loving someone else. Inside jokes I didn't understand, references to plans, dinners, a weekend trip to Cincinnati that I had no memory of him taking, though I distinctly remembered him telling me he was at a work conference in Cleveland that same weekend. And then, near the most recent messages, I found the sentence that made the floor of that office feel like it was tilting underneath me. Michael had written, "I still don't know how we're going to tell Rebecca. I know she's going to be devastated, but I also know Claire and I can't keep living like this, Claire and I." I sat on that floor for a long time, long enough that the light outside the window shifted from morning gray to full daylight. My husband and my sister, not a stranger named Becca who happened to share a version of my name, my own sister, using a nickname I don't think anyone else in her entire life had ever called her. A nickname I now understood she must have invented specifically to keep this hidden from search histories, from phone contacts, from anyone who might stumble across the wrong name at the wrong moment. I want to tell you what I did next, because it wasn't what you might expect. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I closed the laptop, put it back exactly where I found it, and I drove to my parents' house, because I needed to sit in a kitchen that felt safe before I figured out what came next. My mother took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. She sat me down at the same kitchen table where Claire and I had done our homework as kids. And I told her everything, the invitation, the emails, the trip to Cincinnati that had actually been a trip somewhere else entirely. I watched my mother's face go through the exact same journey mine had gone through the day before, confusion sliding slowly and then all at once into horror. There has to be an explanation, my mother said, the same thing I had told myself in the car, and I understood in that moment that this was simply what people say when the truth is too enormous to hold all at once. There wasn't an explanation, not one that made this survivable. I called Claire that afternoon and asked her to meet me for coffee, keeping my voice as normal as I could manage, because I wanted to see her face when I finally said it out loud. Not over the phone, not through a screen, but across a table, close enough to watch every flicker of expression cross her features. She showed up 15 minutes late, apologizing, ordering her usual oat milk latte, sliding into the booth across from me with the same easy warmth she always carried, and for a moment, just a moment, I almost lost my nerve, because this was still my sister, still the person who used to braid my hair before school. Still the voice on the other end of every important phone call of my adult life. Then I set the invitation on the table between us. I watched her face change in real time. The color left at first, then her hands went very still around her coffee cup, and then, for just a second, before she caught herself, I saw something that wasn't shame or guilt. I saw calculation. I saw her deciding in real time which version of the story to tell me. "Rebecca, I can explain," she said, and I remember thinking that those 4 words might be the most honest thing she'd said to me in over a year, because at least she wasn't denying it outright. "Then explain," I said. What followed was 30 minutes of the most surreal conversation of my life, my sister explaining to me, in careful, measured sentences, that she and Michael had fallen in love, that it had happened slowly, that neither of them meant for it to happen, that they had tried to fight it for months before giving in, and that they had been planning to tell me everything after the holidays, once they'd figured out, in her words, the kindest way to do it. "The kindest way," I repeated. "You had a wedding invitation printed with his name and yours before you found the kindest way to tell your sister you'd been sleeping with her husband." Claire's composure cracked slightly. "That invitation was just a mock-up. We hadn't even decided on a date." "You hadn't decided on a date," I said, "but you had decided on a font. I want you to understand something about how the next several weeks unfolded, because it wasn't a single explosive confrontation followed by a clean, satisfying resolution. It was messy and prolonged, and it dragged in almost everyone I loved, one relationship at a time, like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Michael came home that evening to find me sitting in the living room with his laptop open on the coffee table. The emails already pulled up on the screen. He didn't try to deny it either, in some strange way. I think both of them had been waiting for this moment for months, exhausted from the effort of hiding something that large. He told me, almost with relief in his voice, that he had fallen in love with Claire the previous spring, at a family barbecue where I'd had to leave early for a work emergency, leaving the two of them to talk for hours on the back porch. He said it had started as friendship, the kind that develops naturally between people who share someone they both love. And that somewhere in those months, it had turned into something neither of them expected or wanted, but couldn't stop. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said, and I remember laughing, an ugly, involuntary sound, because hurting me was the only possible outcome of what they'd done, and pretending otherwise felt like its own kind of insult. Here is where the story could have simply ended, with a devastating betrayal and a divorce and a fractured family. And honestly, for the first few weeks, that seemed like exactly where it was headed. But betrayal on this scale doesn't stay contained to the people who committed it. It spreads outward through every relationship connected to the original wound, and in my family's case, it split us almost perfectly in half. My mother, to my genuine shock, did not immediately side with me. She loved Claire fiercely, in the particular way parents sometimes love the child who requires more managing, more patience, more forgiveness, and I watched her spend the first month after the truth came out trying to find a version of events where nobody had to be the villain. She would call me and say things like, "I'm not defending what she did, but you have to understand, your sister has never felt as secure as you in relationships," or "Michael says it was mutual, that things had been difficult between you two before any of this started," as though difficulty in a marriage justifies your own sister stepping into it. My father, on the other hand, didn't speak to Claire for months. He was a quiet man by nature, not prone to dramatic gestures. But the day I told him what had happened, he stood up from his recliner, walked to the phone, and called Claire directly. I wasn't in the room for that call, but my mother told me later that it was the only time in her life she'd heard him raise his voice at either of us. The wider family fractured too, in ways I couldn't have predicted. My aunt, my mother's sister, took Claire's side almost immediately, saying things at a family gathering I wasn't even invited to about how these things happen and how I should focus on healing instead of holding on to blame. Language that sounded suspiciously like something Claire herself might have said, filtered through someone eager to smooth over an uncomfortable situation. My cousin Danielle, on the other hand, someone Claire and I had never been especially close with growing up, drove 3 hours to sit with me the weekend everything came out, bringing takeout and simply staying quiet while I cried, which taught me something important about who actually shows up when it matters versus who simply says the right things at dinner parties. The divorce itself was, in the strictly legal sense, straightforward. Ohio is a no-fault divorce state, meaning Michael's infidelity, however devastating, had no direct bearing on the division of our assets or the timeline of the proceedings. I want to be clear about this because I think a lot of people watching expect some dramatic courtroom moment where a judge condemns him publicly for what he did, and that simply isn't how it works. We had been married 3 years, no children, a modest house we bought together, and a lawyer explained to me plainly that the process would be about splitting property fairly, not about assigning moral blame. No matter how badly I wanted someone in a position of authority to say out loud what he had done, that was one of the hardest parts to accept. Honestly, the system wasn't built to give me the reckoning I wanted. It was built to divide furniture and bank accounts efficiently, and I had to grieve the fact that there would be no courtroom moment where Michael was forced to answer for the specific cruelty of choosing my sister, of all people, to betray me with. But something else happened during those months, something I didn't expect, and it started with a phone call from Michael's mother, a woman named Susan who I had always liked, who had welcomed me into her family with genuine warmth from the very first dinner I attended at her house years earlier. Susan called me 2 weeks after everything came out, her voice tight with an anger I could tell she'd been holding in for days. "I need you to know," she said, "that I am furious with my son, what he did to you. And the way he did it, choosing your own sister, there's no version of that I can defend. And I won't pretend otherwise just because he's my child." That call meant more to me than I can fully explain. It was the first time since the invitation in Claire's purse that someone had simply said, without qualification or excuse-making, that what happened to me was wrong. Susan continued showing up in small ways throughout that year, as sending a card on my birthday, calling occasionally, just to check in, and eventually telling me something that changed the entire shape of the story. She told me that this wasn't the first time Michael had done something like this. Years before he met me, in a previous relationship I knew almost nothing about, he had been unfaithful with a close friend of his former girlfriend, under circumstances Susan described as eerily similar to what had happened with Claire. She said she'd hoped, when he met me, that he had genuinely changed, that whatever pattern had shaped his younger self was behind him. I should have told you sooner, Susan said. I told myself it wasn't my place. I regret that more than you know. This piece of information didn't undo any of the pain, but it did something important. It helped me understand that what happened wasn't some unique, unpredictable lightning strike caused by my own failures as a wife, some story I had been quietly telling myself in my worst moments, wondering what I had done wrong, what I could have been that would have made me enough. It was a pattern that existed in Michael long before I ever met him, one that Claire had simply been the latest, most devastating expression of. I want to talk about the moment that changed everything for me, because up until this point, I had mostly been reacting, absorbing blow after blow without much capacity to do anything except survive each one. That changed about 5 months into the separation, when Claire showed up unannounced at my apartment, the small one-bedroom I'd moved into after selling the house, and asked if she could talk to me. I almost didn't let her in, but some part of me, the part that still remembered braided hair in hospital hallways, opened the door anyway. She looked different, thinner, tired in a way makeup couldn't quite cover, and she sat on my second-hand couch and told me that things with Michael had started falling apart, not because of guilt, she was clear about that, but because the qualities that had made their relationship feel so intoxicating in secret, the excitement, the sense of choosing each other against impossible odds, had curdled once they no longer had to sneak around without the secrecy. She said they had discovered they didn't actually have that much in common. The relationship had been built on the thrill of what it was stealing, and once there was nothing left to steal, there wasn't much holding it together. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me, Claire said, and there were tears in her eyes that I believed were genuine, even as I sat there unwilling to offer the comfort she seemed to be hoping for. I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know that I lost something too. Not what you lost, I know it's not the same, but I lost you, and I lost this family, and some days I think that was a worse trade than I ever understood it would be when I let myself fall into this. I asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest for 5 months, unable to find its way out until that exact moment. Was it about him? I asked, or was it about me? Claire didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. I think, for a long time, I felt like I was standing in your shadow, she said. You were the one who did everything right, good grades, good job, good marriage. I used to tell myself I didn't care, that I liked being the fun one, the free spirit, but somewhere along the way, that stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like a consolation prize. When Michael and I started talking, really talking, for the first time in my life I felt like I was the one someone chose first, not the backup, not the sister people compared you to. I know how ugly that sounds when I say it out loud. I'm not proud of it, but you asked me the truth. And that's the truth. I sat with that for a long time after she left that day. I want to tell you I found some clean, generous forgiveness in her explanation, some understanding that made the betrayal easier to carry. But that wouldn't be honest. What I found instead was something more complicated. I understood her reasoning without accepting it as an excuse. Insecurity explains a lot of human behavior, but it doesn't obligate anyone else to absorb the damage of it. My sister's shadow theory might have been true, and it still didn't give her the right to build her sense of worth on the wreckage of my marriage. The following year was, honestly, the hardest of my life, harder even than the months immediately after discovering the truth, because that first period had at least come with adrenaline, the strange energy of crisis that carries you through the worst of something before it fully sets in. The year after was quieter, and quiet grief is its own particular weight. I moved through my days feeling like a stranger in my own life, going to work, coming home, learning slowly how to be a single woman again in my early 30s after imagining an entirely different future for myself. What eventually pulled me out of it wasn't a single dramatic turning point, but a series of small decisions I made almost without realizing their significance at the time. I started therapy, something I had always assumed was for people with more obviously dramatic problems than mine, and learned that betrayal from someone that close doesn't just wound you, it rewires how safe you feel in every relationship afterward, something that takes real, deliberate work to repair. I reconnected with my cousin Danielle, the one who had shown up with takeout that terrible first weekend, and found in her a kind of steady friendship I hadn't fully appreciated before everything fell apart. I started running again, something I'd loved in college and abandoned somewhere in the business of building a marriage, and found that the simple, physical rhythm of it gave my mind somewhere to go besides circling the same painful questions. My relationship with my mother slowly repaired itself too, though it took nearly 2 years and several difficult conversations before I felt like she truly understood the depth of what had happened, rather than treating it as an unfortunate family conflict that simply needed enough time to smooth over. The turning point came when she finally told Claire in my presence that she would no longer participate in conversations that minimized what had been done to me, that loving both her daughters didn't mean pretending one of them hadn't caused catastrophic harm to the other. It wasn't a perfect resolution. My mother still loves Claire, still speaks to her regularly, still hopes, I think, for some eventual version of our family where all three of us can sit at the same table again, but she stopped asking me to be the one who made that possible by simply absorbing the damage quietly. As for Claire and Michael, their relationship ended entirely about 8 months after that conversation on my couch, and neither of them reached out to me when it happened, which honestly felt like the most respectful thing either of them had done throughout the entire ordeal. I heard about it secondhand through my mother, months after the fact, and I remember sitting with the news and feeling almost nothing at all, which surprised me more than any dramatic emotional reaction would have. I had spent so long imagining what I would feel if their relationship collapsed, some vindictive satisfaction, some sense of justice finally served, and instead I felt mostly like someone reading about strangers. That numbness, I came to understand through therapy, wasn't coldness, it was distance, hard-won and necessary, the natural result of finally putting enough space between myself and the people who had hurt me that their choices no longer had the power to move me one way or another. I see Claire occasionally now. At family events I choose carefully, usually the ones large enough that we can exist in the same room without needing to speak directly. We are not close. I don't think we ever will be again, not in the way we once were, and I've made peace with that loss the same way I've made peace with the loss of my marriage, understanding that some things, once broken in a particular way, simply cannot be fully repaired, no matter how much time passes or how much everyone involved might wish otherwise. What we have now is a careful, distant civility, the kind built for the sake of our parents, who are getting older and who deserve, I think, to have both their daughters in the same room on the holidays that matter most to them, even if those daughters will never again be what they once were to each other. I married again 2 years ago. His name is David, and he is, in almost every observable way, the opposite of dramatic, the opposite of charming in that dangerous, effortless way Michael had been. He is steady in a manner that used to seem boring to me when I was younger and looking for excitement, and that now feels like the safest, most valuable quality a person can offer. When I told him the full story of what happened with Michael and Claire, early in our relationship, before things had gotten serious, he listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he simply said, "I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not her, and you don't have to prove that to yourself by testing me, you just have to let time show you." I think about that sentence often, because it turned out to be exactly right. Time did show me, not all at once, not in some clean, cinematic realization, but slowly, through 1,000 small, consistent choices that Michael and Claire, in their own way, had never been willing to make. If you were in my position, discovering the person you trusted most and the person you loved most had built an entire secret life together behind your back, I think you'd understand why this story took me years to be ready to tell. I'd genuinely like to know what you think you would have done in my place. Would you have found a way back to your sister eventually, or would some betrayals always be too large to cross back over? Let me know in the comments below, because I think there's real value in hearing how differently people carry this kind of pain, and what forgiveness means to each of us differently. And if this story resonated with you, or reminded you of your own experience with a betrayal you never expected from the people closest to you, please consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone in carrying something like this. Thank you for spending time with The Quiet Rise. I'll see you in the next story.